So about a week ago, I posted a video just talking about the amazingly positive results that I've had on my first full month on the keto diet. If you haven't watched it already, you totally should. I'll go ahead and put a link somewhere in the doobly-doo. But that video was getting a little bit long, and so I decided to cut it up and make a second video just talking about all of the hurdles and challenges that I had on that first month of keto. Because believe me, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Anyway, so that's what you're watching right now. So I'm gonna get out of my own way and let you see what I had to say a week ago. I've had some hurdles along the way already that I'd like to share with you just in case you're thinking about going on this journey. So at its core, the ketogenic diet is a low-carb, high-fat diet. And right out of the gate, that's going to blow some people's minds because if you're like me and you grew up in the 80s and 90s, we were told completely the opposite. Fat was the enemy, you needed to restrict fat to almost nothing, and you needed to compensate by eating carbs, which had no fats associated, so things like whole grains. The whole point of the ketogenic diet is to lower carbs so that you're forcing your body to use ketones as its primary source of fuel. Ketones are derived and synthesized from breaking down fats. And those fats can be either fats that you consume or fats that you have stored, and I've got plenty of that. So my first week on keto, I didn't really understand how drastically you would need to cut carbs and sugar. So I made a smoothie in the morning, but I used apples and oranges as the base. Little did I know that one apple or one orange probably has enough sugar to kick you out of ketosis right out of the gate. Even in spite of that mistake, in that first week, I switched to higher fats, I had that smoothie in the morning, and to my surprise, I dropped 10 pounds in a week. I found out later that a lot of this is because your body is dumping glycogen stores. So your body prefers to run on glucose. And since I was cutting my glucose consumption significantly by limiting the amount of carbs that I was eating, my body was having to tap into its glycogen stores. And those glycogen stores have a lot of water attached to them. So as my body was desperately trying to find some glucose to consume, it was also eliminating the water that was attached to it. So by week 2, I had done a little bit more research and I started cutting back aggressively on sugar and carbs. And I noticed in this week, I had a lot more mental clarity. I would be in meetings during the 3 o'clock slump and I would just be firing off ideas, not pausing between sentences. I had no trouble articulating what I wanted to say. It's also kind of the peak of allergy season here. And so I was really raspy and congested going into trying the keto diet. In this week, I realized that I was less raspy, I was less congested, I could breathe better. And by the end of this week, I had lost a couple more pounds as well. Now, on the 3rd week, I discovered the importance of optimizing your macronutrient ratios. So for those of you who don't know, there are 3 macronutrients: carbs, protein, and fat. And out of those 3 macronutrients, that comprises 100% of what you eat in a day, because math. If you take the carbohydrate part of that pie, pun intended, and you shrink it down to only about 5%, which is what you need to be in ketosis, you have to make up that deficit somehow. And so the way that you do that is by expanding fat intake to about 70% of your diet on the low end. Protein's about 25%. Like if you've never tracked your macros, hitting 70% fat is not the easiest thing. You actually have to put some thought into the composition of your food in order to do it. So week 3 for me was all about trying to hit that 70% fat threshold. So we made a huge bag of carnitas in the slow cooker, and I used that most days with some broccoli for lunch. I also tried incorporating interval fasting in this week. So basically I would have my last meal around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and I wouldn't eat again until breakfast the next morning. Now, a lot of people think that that's a lot of time to go without food, but because of the fat content and the protein content, you feel a lot more satiated on the keto diet. And so it didn't really feel like that much of a burden until about an hour or 2 before bedtime. And normally by then I would just chug a glass of water and I'd be good for the rest of the evening. Now, in this week, despite trying harder, weight loss was a lot more modest. I only lost about a pound or 2. And that was just the start of hitting a couple of bumps in the road that I'm still figuring out. So about the end of that week, that clarity of thought that I had mentioned just went away. I felt super foggy, super groggy, super tired, and I had this throbbing, pounding headache. People at work definitely noticed I was not my normal bright and cheery and energetic self. I came to find out later that this is something called the keto flu. And it happens because as your body is dumping all that water weight and as you're switching the composition of your body to running on ketones, you actually need a lot more electrolytes than what our current dietary guidelines would think is standard. So this is stuff like sodium and potassium and magnesium, and I wasn't intentionally ingesting foods or supplementing to get any of those things. So I found these things called Zip Fizz, which are zero sugar, low carb, and you just throw them in water and they give you a pretty good electrolyte balance for the day. But early on, I was having to take a couple of those just to get rid of these keto flu symptoms. Now going into the 4th week, that's where everything started to fall apart just a little bit. So I ended up getting sick. I got a little bit of a cold. It wasn't a big deal, but it did keep me home a couple of days, which was frustrating. I did notice though that my symptoms weren't as extreme as they normally are. It definitely felt like a low grade cold, and I don't know if I just caught a bug that wasn't particularly aggressive or if my immune system was just a lot more efficient in handling it, but it did seem to be a pretty mild case of the flu. But right as I was getting over that, I got a gout attack. And I'll probably do a separate video on gout, but I've been struggling with gout for most of my adult life. If you don't know what it is, basically some people are predisposed to having more uric acid in their bloodstream than others. That's hereditary. So I inherited that from my grandfather. The problem is this uric acid crystallizes and starts depositing in your joints. So it's a form of arthritis. And for me, it deposits in my ankle joint. Most commonly, it deposits in people's big toe. But for me, since it deposits in my ankle, I cannot walk when I get a gout attack. And I just had one about a month ago that took me out for 10 days. And it was really frustrating to be in that position again, because normally I only have one gout attack a year. And so to have 2 in 2 months was just exhausting. Now that being said, at this point, I had done enough research to know that this was a possibility. The ketogenic diet is high in fats and protein, and those fats and proteins have purines in them, which your body turns into uric acid. So I had anticipated this, and I went to see my doctor, and he prescribed me something called allopurinol. And allopurinol lowers the level of uric acid concentration in your bloodstream. You're supposed to take it every day for as long as you're managing the condition. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of taking a medication every single day. But I did start taking it when I felt the gout attack coming on, and it did seem to help. It lessened the severity of that gout attack, so I was only out for a couple of days. After the gout attack was over and I stepped back on the scales, I had gained back 4 or 5 pounds. So I hopped on the internet, and it sounds like a lot of people who take allopurinol have noticed that it does contribute to weight gain. So I stopped taking the medication right away, and I just kind of stuck it out for a couple of days, and eventually the gout attack subsided. Now I've done some research, and there are some studies that suggest that after you go through a period of keto adaptation, which normally takes about 4 to 6 weeks for people on the diet, the risk of gout attack actually decreases because your body becomes more optimized to processing the kinds of foods in the quantities that you are feeding it. But in the short term, while you're doing the work to become keto adapted, your risk factors are higher. And I definitely experienced that. I'm making this investment so that I can kick this thing for good, but I'm hoping that my genetics aren't going to be a deal breaker here. So that's been my experience my first month on keto. It hasn't been without its struggles, but there's enough positives there to really keep me hopeful that this is something that will help me to be healthy for the long term. Either way, I'll keep you guys updated on the journey.